glossy brochures felt cold in my hand, a stark contrast to the warmth of the back patting and handshakes that had filled the last hour. The paper was thick, expensive, printed with images of smiling, silver-haired seniors playing shuffleboard or painting watercolors in sun-drenched common rooms. The titles were cheerful, almost aggressively so: Golden Horizons, Sunset Meadows, Serenity Gardens. My daughter Amelia stood before me, her smile a perfect, polished veneer. It was the same smile she used in her corporate headshots, the one that never quite reached her eyes. She had just given a speech, a toast to me, her father, on the occasion of my retirement after 40 years at the same engineering firm. Her words had been flawless, full of anecdotes about my work ethic, my dedication, my sacrifices. The crowd had applauded. Some had even shed a tear. And now, in the relative quiet after the applause had died down, she had leaned in, kissed my cheek, and pressed this neat little stack of papers into my hand. "Just some light reading for you, Dad," she had whispered, her voice a conspiratorial murmur, "to help you plan for the next chapter." I looked down at the brochures, then back up at her perfect, smiling face, and in that moment, the cheerful, noisy banquet hall seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of us in a sudden, chilling silence. The next chapter, I thought. She had already written it for me, and it was a horror story. It had all started, I suppose, 40 years ago, when I first held her in my arms, a tiny, screaming bundle wrapped in a soft hospital blanket. But the end, the real end of the man I used to be, began that night, at a party meant to celebrate my life's work. The party itself was a blur of familiar faces and forced pleasantries. My colleagues, men and women I'd spent more time with than my own family over the past 4 decades, shared stories that all seemed to blend into one. "Remember that project in '98, Arthur? You were always the first one in, last one out. The place won't be the same without you." I smiled, I nodded, I accepted the engraved watch and the company plaque with practiced gratitude. It was all a performance, a final act in a long-running play. My heart wasn't in it. My heart, it seemed, had retired years ago, the day I buried my wife, Eleanor. Eleanor would have hated this party. She would have found it stuffy and insincere. She would have stood beside me, her hand a warm, steady presence in the small of my back, and whispered sarcastic comments about my boss's toupee or the questionable color of the punch. She would have made me laugh, a real, deep laugh that would have cut through the polite applause like a thunderclap. But Eleanor was gone. She had been gone for 5 years, and the silence she left behind was a physical presence in my life, a constant, hollow ache in my chest. Her absence tonight was particularly sharp. This milestone, this closing of a major chapter of my life, was something we had planned for together. We were supposed to travel. We had a map on our kitchen wall, dotted with pins marking all the places we wanted to see: the canals of Venice, the mountains of Switzerland, the rugged coast of Ireland where her grandparents were from. The map was still there, a faded monument to a future that had been stolen from us. Amelia, our only child, had organized the party. On the surface, it was a thoughtful gesture. She had booked the hall, arranged the catering, and invited everyone. She had taken care of every detail with her typical, unnerving efficiency. Her husband, Mark, a man who always looked like he was smelling something unpleasant, hovered at her side, his hand possessively on her arm. He was a real estate developer, and he carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who had never known a day of real struggle. He clapped me on the shoulder, his grip a little too firm. "Congratulations, Arthur," he said, his voice booming. "Time to put your feet up. You've earned it." He sounded like he was reading from a script. I looked at him, then at my daughter. They made a handsome couple, both tall and stylish, radiating an aura of success and ambition. They were the picture of the modern power couple. But as I stood there, clutching the brochures for Sunset Meadows, I saw something else. I saw a coldness, a transactional quality to their smiles and their words. My retirement wasn't a celebration to them. It was a business transaction. It was the closing of one account and the opening of another. The account of Arthur, the provider, was now closed. It was time to open the account of Arthur, the liability. After Amelia handed me the brochures, she and Mark were quickly swallowed back into the crowd. I stood alone for a moment, the weight of the glossy paper in my hand feeling heavier than any toolbox I had ever carried. I slipped them into the inside pocket of my jacket, the smooth paper crinkling against the rough fabric. It felt like a secret, a shameful one. I made my excuses early, pleading fatigue, which wasn't entirely a lie. The emotional exhaustion was a physical force, pressing down on my shoulders, making my legs feel like lead. The drive home was quiet. The city lights blurred past my window, a watercolor of reds and golds that I barely registered. My mind was a maelstrom of confusion and a deep, gnawing hurt that was so profound it felt like a physical injury. I let myself into the house Eleanor and I had bought 45 years ago. It was a modest brick colonial, the kind of place people used to raise families in before everyone wanted open-concept floor plans and stainless steel kitchens. Every corner of it was saturated with memories. The scuff mark on the baseboard in the hallway was from Amelia's tricycle when she was 4. The faint water stain on the dining room ceiling was from the time I'd let the bathtub overflow while trying to give her a bath and read a schematic at the same time. The house wasn't just wood and brick. It was a living archive of our lives. It was my sanctuary. It was home. I walked into the kitchen and flicked on the light. The first thing I saw was the map on the wall, the colorful pins still waiting for a journey that would never happen. I ran my hand over the faded paper, my fingers tracing the route we had planned through Italy. A wave of grief, as fresh and raw as it was 5 years ago, washed over me. "Oh, Eleanor," I whispered to the empty room, "you wouldn't believe this." I pulled the brochures from my pocket and spread them out on the kitchen table. They looked obscene there, laid out on the worn oak surface where we had shared thousands of meals, where Amelia had done her homework, where Eleanor had rolled out dough for her famous apple pies. The smiling faces of the residents seemed to mock me. They were actors, paid to perform a fantasy of carefree old age. I read the descriptions, the words blurring through a haze of unshed tears. Assisted living, memory care, 24-hour skilled nursing. They were euphemisms, gentle words to soften the harsh reality of being put away, of being deemed a burden. Something inside me, a core of resilience I thought had died with Eleanor, began to harden. The hurt was still there, a hot coal in my gut, but it was now being tempered by a slow burning anger. This was not just a thoughtless gesture from a busy daughter. This was premeditated. The quality of the brochures, the fact that she had them ready at my retirement party, the slick, rehearsed way she had handed them to me, it was a plan. They had been discussing this. They had decided my future for me, without me. They saw this house, not as a home filled with a lifetime of memories, but as an asset to be liquidated. They saw me, not as a father, but as an obstacle. I sat there for hours, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I thought back over the years, searching for the moment when my daughter had become this stranger. It hadn't happened overnight. It was a slow erosion, a gradual chipping away of the girl I had known. It started, I think, when she went to college, an expensive private university that I had worked double shifts to pay for. She came back different, with a new vocabulary and a faint, almost imperceptible disdain for our simple, working-class life. Then came Mark, with his talk of stock portfolios and property development. He had encouraged her ambition, but he had also nurtured the seed of materialism that had been planted in her. I remembered conversations, fragments I had dismissed at the time. "Dad, this house is so big for just one person. The property taxes must be a killer. You know, Mark was saying that a developer would pay a fortune for this lot." At the time, I had heard them as idle comments, casual observations. Now, in the harsh glare of the kitchen light, I understood them for what they were: probes, tests, the laying of groundwork for the plan that had culminated tonight. They were not concerned for my well-being. They were concerned for their inheritance. I thought of the sacrifices Eleanor and I had made. We never took lavish vacations. We drove our cars until they fell apart. We packed our own lunches. We did it all for Amelia, to give her the opportunities we never had. We had poured our lives, our love, and our savings into her, hoping she would grow into a woman of substance, of character, of compassion. And what had we created? A woman who saw her aging father as a line item on a balance sheet, a problem to be managed efficiently. The anger solidified into a cold, hard resolve. I would not be managed. I would not be put away in Sunset Meadows to paint watercolors until I died. I would not let them sell my home, Eleanor's home, and erase our history to fund their next luxury vacation or a down payment on a bigger, emptier house. I had spent 40 years building bridges and designing structures that were meant to last. I had spent a lifetime being a provider, a protector, a father. That man was not gone. He was just retired. He was not, however, finished. I stood up and walked from the kitchen into my small study. It was a cluttered room filled with books on engineering, history, and Eleanor's beloved gardening. On my desk, in a locked drawer, was a file folder. It contained all of our important documents, our marriage certificate, birth certificates, the deed to the house, and our wills. I unlocked the drawer and pulled out the folder. I found my will, the one Eleanor and I had drafted together with our lawyer and friend George years ago. It was a simple, straightforward document. Everything we had, the house, the savings, the investments, was to be left to our sole heir, Amelia. It was what we had always wanted, what we had worked our whole lives for, to provide for our child. I held the document in my hand, the pages feeling flimsy and outdated. This will was a testament to a love and trust that I now realized was a one-way street. It was based on the assumption that our daughter would love and honor us in return, that she would be a steward of our legacy, not a liquidator. That assumption had been shattered tonight. A profound sense of clarity washed over me, cutting through the grief and the anger. It was a quiet, cold, and absolute certainty. I knew what I had to do. I picked up the phone. It was late, but I knew George was a night owl. He answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly with sleep. "Arthur, is everything all right?" "George," I said, my own voice steady and calm, a stark contrast to the tempest inside me. "I'm fine, but I need to see you. I need to make a change, a significant change, to my will." There was a pause on the other end of the line. George had known me for 30 years. He had been there for Eleanor's funeral. He knew the depth of my love for my daughter. "Arthur," he said slowly, "what's happened?" "I just got back from my retirement party," I said. "Amelia gave me a gift, a stack of brochures for nursing homes." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. George didn't need any more explanation. He was a lawyer. He had seen the dark underbelly of family dynamics more times than he could count. "I see," he finally said, his voice losing its sleepiness and taking on a professional edge. "My office, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." "I'll be there," I said, and hung up the phone. I looked at the old will in my hand, then at the brochures on the kitchen table. It was a declaration of war, and I had not started it, but I would, by God, I would finish it. The next chapter was about to be written, but I would be the one holding the pen. The next morning, I woke before the sun. I had not slept, not really. I had drifted in and out of a restless doze, haunted by images of Amelia's smiling face and the cold, glossy paper of the brochures. I made coffee, the familiar ritual a small comfort in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. As the dark liquid dripped into the pot, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, I walked through the house, seeing it with new eyes. It was no longer just my home. It was a fortress. It was the last piece of ground that was truly mine, and I had to defend it. I looked at the photographs on the mantelpiece. A smiling Eleanor on our wedding day, a gap-toothed Amelia on her first day of school, a family portrait from a vacation to the Grand Canyon 20 years ago, all of us squinting in the bright sun. We looked so happy, so normal. Had the cracks been there even then, hidden beneath the surface? Had I been blind to them, willfully ignorant in my desire to believe in the perfect family I thought we were? The past day had been a brutal awakening. It was like living in a house your whole life, only to discover one day that the foundations were rotten. Now that I was looking, I could see the signs everywhere. The way Amelia's calls had become less frequent over the years, often ending with a not-so-subtle inquiry about my health or the upkeep of the house. The way she and Mark would exchange glances when I talked about my plans to fix the roof or landscape the backyard. They weren't seeing a home being cared for. They were seeing money being spent, their inheritance being diminished. I remembered a specific conversation from a few months ago. I had been excited, telling Amelia about a local charity that built homes for veterans. I was thinking of volunteering, maybe even donating a small amount. "That's nice, Dad," she had said, her voice tight. "But you need to be careful with your money now. You're on a fixed income. You have to think about future expenses. Healthcare, you know." At the time, I had thought it was a sign of her concern. Now I recognized the cold panic of an heir watching her assets walk out the door. The drive to George's office was a journey through my own history. I passed the park where I taught Amelia to ride her bike, her small hands gripping the handlebars with a fierce determination that I had once admired and now saw as a precursor to her ruthless ambition. I passed the high school where I had sat in the bleachers for every one of her soccer games, my voice raw from cheering her on. I had been her biggest fan, her staunchest defender. The sense of betrayal was a physical thing, a bitter taste in the back of my throat. George's office was in an old, respectable brick building downtown. His secretary, a kind woman named Margaret, who had been with him for decades, greeted me with a sympathetic smile. "He's waiting for you, Arthur. Can I get you some coffee?" I declined. My nerves were already frayed enough. George was standing by the window when I entered, a tall, slightly stooped man with a mane of white hair and eyes that had seen too much of human nature to be easily shocked. His office was lined with books, not just law tomes, but history, philosophy, and poetry. He was a thoughtful man, a good man. He turned and gave me a firm handshake. "Arthur, sit down." I sat in the worn leather chair opposite his large oak desk. He didn't rush me. He simply sat and waited, letting the silence settle. Finally, I told him everything. I told him about the party, the speech, the brochures. I told him about the conversation I'd overheard, the comments about the property taxes, the palpable greed I now saw so clearly in my daughter and her husband. I spoke for a long time, the words pouring out of me in a torrent of pain and anger. When I finished, George leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on a point just over my shoulder. "Greed," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's the oldest story in the book, Arthur. It poisons everything it touches. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry it has come to this." "I don't want your sorrow, George," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "I want your help. I want to change the will. I want to cut her out. Completely." George nodded slowly. "That is your right, of course. But I have to advise you, as your lawyer and your friend, to think this through very carefully. Disinheriting a child is a drastic step. It's final. It can be contested. She could claim you weren't of sound mind, that you were under undue influence." "Sound mind?" I let out a short, harsh laugh. "George, I've never been of sounder mind in my life. For the first time in years, I'm seeing everything with perfect clarity. And as for undue influence, whose influence would that be? The ghosts of common decency, my late wife's memory?" "I understand your anger," he said gently. "But we have to be strategic. We need to build a case, a narrative, that will make your decision unassailable. We need to document everything, your reasons, your state of mind. We need to make it ironclad." And so began my new project. It was the most important project of my life, requiring all the meticulous planning and attention to detail that I had honed over 40 years as an engineer. George guided me through the process. The first step was a full medical and psychological evaluation. I went to a doctor recommended by George, a man I had never met before, to eliminate any possibility of a conflict of interest. I underwent a battery of tests, both physical and cognitive. The results were clear. I was in excellent health, with no signs of cognitive decline or dementia. The doctor wrote a detailed report, which George had notarized and filed away. That was the first brick in our wall. Next, George advised me to start a journal. "Write down everything, Arthur," he said. "Every conversation with Amelia and Mark, every comment, every phone call. Note the date, the time, what was said. This will create a contemporaneous record of their behavior and your feelings about it. It will show a pattern." I bought a simple, leather-bound notebook and began to write. It was difficult at first, dredging up painful memories and conversations. But as I wrote, something shifted inside me. The act of putting my thoughts and feelings onto paper gave them shape and substance. It validated my experience. I was no longer just a victim of their cruelty. I was an observer, a chronicler of their deceit. Amelia called a few days after the party. Her voice was bright and cheerful, as if nothing had happened. "Hi, Dad. Just calling to see how you're settling into retirement. Have you had a chance to look at those materials I gave you?" I took a deep breath, clutching the pen in my hand, my journal open on the desk in front of me. "I've glanced at them, Amelia," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Great. There are some really wonderful options there. Sunset Meadows has a fantastic arts and crafts program. I thought of you and your old woodworking hobby. And Mark and I were thinking we could come over this weekend and help you start, decluttering. It's a big house, Dad. It would be a lot easier to make the transition if you start downsizing now." The transition. Downsizing. The euphemisms were back, a thick layer of sugar coating the bitter pill she wanted me to swallow. "That's thoughtful of you," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "But I'm not ready to make any decisions just yet. I'm enjoying my time off." There was a slight pause, a flicker of irritation in her voice when she replied, "Of course, Dad, but you shouldn't wait too long. These places have waiting lists, and we're just worried about you, all alone in that big house. What if you fell? Who would know?" Her concern was a weapon, sharpened and aimed at my deepest fears. The fear of being old, of being helpless, of being a burden. It was a masterful piece of manipulation. The old me would have caved, would have been consumed by guilt and fear. But the new me, the chronicler, simply wrote it all down. Date, time, phone call from Amelia, expressed concern about my safety, pushed again for downsizing, mentioned waiting lists. While I was building my defense, I was also planning my offense. George and I had long discussions about the new will. "If you're not leaving it to Amelia, then who, Arthur?" he asked. "You need to have a beneficiary. Leaving it all to no one is not an option." This was the question that kept me up at night. My entire life had been oriented around providing for my daughter. Without her as the focal point, my financial world felt unmoored. I didn't have any other close family. My siblings were long gone, and their children were practically strangers to me. I thought about Eleanor. What would she have wanted? She was a practical woman, but her heart was always with the underdog. She volunteered at the local animal shelter. She donated to the food bank every month. She always had a few dollars for the homeless man who sat outside the grocery store. Her compassion was the bedrock of our family, a quality that, I now sadly realized, had not been passed down to our daughter. And then, the answer came to me, clear and simple. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Amelia, the one about the charity that built homes for veterans. Her dismissive reaction had been one of the final straws for me. These were men and women who had sacrificed for their country, only to come home to find themselves struggling, sometimes homeless. They had been let down by the system, just as I felt I was being let down by my own family. There was a symmetry to it, a rightness that resonated deep in my soul. There was also another cause close to my heart. Eleanor had died of cancer. The hospice that had cared for her in her final weeks had been a place of incredible compassion and dignity. The nurses and doctors there were angels on earth, providing comfort not just to her, but to me. They had held my hand. They had listened to my fears. They had treated my wife with a tenderness and respect that I would never forget. When I told George my plan, a slow smile spread across his face. "Arthur," he said, "that is a beautiful idea, a legacy of substance." So we drafted the new will. It was a meticulous document. I divided my entire estate into 2 equal shares. Half was to go to the Veterans Housing Initiative, with a specific clause that it be used for the construction of new homes, not for administrative costs. The other half was to go to the Eleanor Vance Hospice Center, named after my late wife, to fund a new wing for patient care. And in the will, I included a specific clause, a final statement to be read aloud. The clause was my own composition, written and rewritten over many late nights in my study. It detailed my reasons for disinheriting my daughter. It did not use angry or emotional language. Instead, it was a calm, factual account of the events that had led to my decision, starting with the retirement party and the nursing home brochures. It spoke of my love for her as a child and my profound disappointment in the woman she had become. It spoke of the belief that a legacy is not about money, but about values. And it concluded with the statement that my estate, built on a lifetime of hard work and love, would be used to support those who embodied the values of compassion and self-sacrifice that my daughter had so clearly abandoned. The final piece of the puzzle was the house. I couldn't bear the thought of Mark, the real estate developer, getting his hands on it, tearing it down to build some soulless McMansion. So I made another decision. I contacted a local historical society. Our house wasn't a grand mansion, but it was a good example of post-war architecture in our neighborhood, one of the few that hadn't been torn down or drastically altered. I made a proposal. Upon my death, the house and its contents would be donated to the society, to be preserved as a small community museum or a library, a quiet place for reflection. They were ecstatic. With every step I took, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The grief and hurt were still there, but they were no longer the only things I felt. I felt a sense of purpose, of control. I was no longer a passive victim waiting for the inevitable. I was an architect, designing my own future, my own legacy. Throughout this period, I maintained a facade of normalcy with Amelia and Mark. I played the part of the slightly confused, aging father. When they came over to help me declutter, I let them. I watched as they moved through my house, their eyes assessing the value of every piece of furniture, every painting, every book. Amelia picked up a small silver locket from Eleanor's jewelry box. "I'll hold on to this for you, Dad," she said, slipping it into her purse, "for safekeeping." I just nodded, my heart a cold, hard stone in my chest. I documented it all in my journal. They were so confident, so sure of their victory. They saw my compliance as a sign of weakness, of resignation. They had no idea that I was watching them, recording their every move, building my case against them brick by brick. Their arrogance was my greatest weapon. They had underestimated me. They had mistaken my quiet nature for frailty. It was a mistake they would come to regret. The day I signed the final version of the new will was a beautiful autumn afternoon. The leaves on the maple tree outside George's office were a brilliant blaze of red and gold. I signed the document with a steady hand, Margaret and another lawyer from the firm acting as witnesses. As I put the pen down, I felt a profound sense of peace. It was done. My legacy was secure. Eleanor's memory was honored. My dignity was intact. Now, all that was left was the final act. I needed to create a stage, a moment of confrontation where the truth could be revealed. I couldn't just let them find out after I was gone. That felt cowardly. I needed to face them, to tell them myself. I wanted to see their faces when the carefully constructed world of their own entitlement came crashing down around them. It wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming the narrative of my own life. I went home and called Amelia. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," I told her, my voice infused with a manufactured weariness. "About planning for the future. I've made some decisions. I've been working with my lawyer George to get my estate in order. He'd like to have a meeting with all of us, just to go over everything, make sure it's all clear." I could almost hear the triumphant smirk on the other end of the line. "Of course, Dad. That's so responsible of you. We'd be happy to. When and where?" "George's office," I said. "Next Tuesday, 2 o'clock. "We'll be there," she said, her voice practically purring. "Don't you worry about a thing, Dad. We'll take care of everything." "I know you will," I said, and hung up the phone. The stage was set. The actors had been summoned. The final curtain was about to rise. The week leading up to the meeting was one of the longest of my life. I moved through my days in a state of strange calm, a quiet anticipation. I worked in the garden, pruning Eleanor's roses for the last time that season. I went through old photo albums, not with sadness, but with a sense of quiet closure. I was saying goodbye, not to my life, but to the life I had lived with my daughter, to the man who had been her father. That man was about to be laid to rest, and a new one was about to be born from his ashes. On the morning of the meeting, I chose my clothes carefully. I didn't wear a suit, which would have felt like a costume. I wore a simple pair of gray trousers, a crisp blue shirt, and a tweed jacket that had been a favorite of Eleanor's. It still smelled faintly of her perfume. It was my armor. I arrived at George's office 20 minutes early. He and I went over the plan one last time. He had a copy of the old will and the new will in separate folders on his desk. He also had my journal and the doctor's report in a third folder just in case. "Are you sure about this, Arthur?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "There's still time to turn back." "I'm sure," I said, my voice unwavering. "It's time." Amelia and Mark arrived precisely at 2 o'clock. They swept into the conference room like conquering heroes. Amelia was dressed in a sharp, expensive-looking business suit, Mark in a tailored blazer that probably cost more than my first car. They exuded an aura of confidence and control. They were here to finalize the terms of their victory. "Dad," Amelia said, kissing the air next to my cheek, "you're looking well." "Mr. Vance," Mark said, giving me a brisk, firm handshake. "Good to see you taking this step. Very prudent." They sat down opposite me at the long, polished conference table. George took his place at the head of the table, a silent, imposing figure. He nodded at them gravely. "Amelia, Mark, thank you for coming." "Of course, George," Amelia said, her voice smooth as silk. "We're just here to support Dad in any way we can. We want to make this transition as smooth as possible for him." She placed a proprietary hand on my arm. I did not flinch. George cleared his throat. "Well, let's get to it. Arthur has indeed been making some plans for his estate, and he wanted you both here to understand his decisions clearly." He slid the folder containing the old will across the table towards Amelia. "This is a copy of Arthur's existing will, drafted in 2010. As you know, it names you, Amelia, as the sole beneficiary of the entire estate, including the house, all savings, and investments." Amelia glanced at the document with a practiced nonchalance, as if she were reviewing a routine business contract. Mark leaned over her shoulder, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Seems straightforward enough," he said. "Yes, it was," I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room, and they both looked at me surprised. "It was straightforward. It was based on the love and trust a father has for his daughter. It was based on the assumption that she would honor the memory of her mother and the home we built together." Amelia's smile tightened slightly. "Dad, of course I will. What are you talking about?" I looked her directly in the eye. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let any anger seep into my tone. I spoke with the calm, measured precision of an engineer describing a structural failure. "I'm talking about my retirement party, Amelia. I'm talking about the gift you gave me." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out one of the brochures for Sunset Meadows. I slid it across the table. It landed next to the will with a soft slap. The color drained from Amelia's face. Mark's smug expression vanished, replaced by a look of confusion, then alarm. "Dad, That was just an idea," she stammered. "We were just trying to be helpful, to show you the options." "Options?" I repeated, the word tasting like poison. "You mean the option to put me away so you could sell my house, your mother's house?" "That's not true," she said, her voice rising. "We were worried about you." "Were you worried about me when you told Mark that the property taxes were a killer and that a developer would pay a fortune for the lot?" I asked calmly. "Were you worried about me when you decided, without ever speaking to me, that my next chapter would be in a facility waiting to die?" Amelia was speechless. She looked at Mark, who was now staring at me, with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He had clearly underestimated the quiet old man he had been so eager to get out of the way. George chose that moment to intervene. He slid the second folder across the table. "As of last week," he said, his voice a calm, authoritative bass, "the will you just looked at has been rendered null and void. This," he tapped the new folder, "is Arthur's new, legally binding, last will and testament." Amelia's hand trembled as she reached for the folder. She opened it, her eyes scanning the first page. I watched as the full import of the words registered on her face. Her jaw went slack. Her eyes widened in horror. She looked up at me, her face a mask of utter disbelief. "What is this?" she whispered. "The Veterans Housing Initiative, the Eleanor Vance Hospice Center. What have you done?" "It's a joke," Mark snarled, snatching the papers from her. He read through them quickly, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is ridiculous. He can't do this. He's an old man. He's obviously confused. You put him up to this," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at George. On the contrary, George said, his voice like ice. Arthur underwent a full medical and psychological evaluation before signing this document. We have a notarized report from a certified geriatric specialist stating that he is of exceptionally sound mind and body. Furthermore, he has kept a detailed journal for the past several weeks, documenting every interaction with the two of you, including your repeated attempts to pressure him into selling his home and moving into a facility. It paints a very clear picture of your motives. The air went out of Mark. He sank back into his chair, sputtering. But Amelia was not done. The shock was now morphing into a volcanic rage. She stood up so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "How could you?" she screamed at me, her voice cracking. "After everything I've done for you, I planned your party. I tried to help you plan your future." "You planned my future to benefit yourself," I said, my voice still quiet, but now filled with the weight of years of unspoken disappointment. "You didn't see a father who needed love and respect. You saw a problem that needed to be managed, an asset that needed to be liquidated. You saw a house, not a home. You saw a bank account, not a legacy." "It's my inheritance," she shrieked, tears of fury now streaming down her face. "It's mine. You can't just give it away to strangers." "It was never yours, Amelia," I said softly. "It was mine and your mother's. We built it, and it is my right to decide what happens to it. And I have decided that it will go to people who understand the meaning of sacrifice, of compassion, of dignity, values you seem to have forgotten." I paused, then delivered the final blow. "As for the house, it's been donated to the Historical Society. It will be preserved in your mother's memory. It will never be torn down. Mark will never get his hands on it." That was it. That was the moment she broke. A raw, guttural sob escaped her lips. Her carefully constructed facade of the competent, successful businesswoman shattered into a million pieces, revealing the grasping, entitled child beneath. She turned on Mark. This is your fault. You and your stupid ideas about property values. You pushed me." "Me?" he shouted back. "You were the one who couldn't wait to get your hands on his money. You were drawing up renovation plans before he was even retired." Their ugly, frantic argument filled the sterile conference room. It was a pathetic, horrifying spectacle. All their greed and resentment, usually hidden behind polite smiles and careful words, was now laid bare for all to see. George and I sat in silence, watching the self-immolation. Finally, George stood up. "I think this meeting is over," he said, his voice cutting through their squabbling. He opened the door to the conference room. "You should leave." Mark, red-faced and defeated, grabbed his coat and stormed out without another word. Amelia lingered for a moment. She looked at me, her face streaked with tears and mascara, her eyes pleading. For a second, I saw a flicker of the little girl I once knew, the one who would run to me when she was hurt. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold, hard resentment. "I'll fight this," she hissed. "You're a senile old fool, and I will prove it in court." "You do that, Amelia," I said, my voice weary. "George has all the documentation. It will be a very public, very ugly fight for you. I suspect your reputation won't survive it." Her face fell. She knew I was right. She had built her entire identity around the image of success and control. A public court battle, revealing her as a greedy, manipulative daughter trying to swindle her elderly father, would destroy her. She gave me one last look, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, and then she was gone. The door closed behind her, and a profound silence descended on the room. It was over. I leaned back in my chair, the tension draining out of me, leaving me feeling hollowed out, but clean. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was George. "You did the right thing, Arthur," he said softly. I nodded, unable to speak. A single tear, the first I had shed through this whole ordeal, traced a path down my cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of relief, of release. The war was over. I had defended my home. I had honored my wife. I had reclaimed my life. In the days that followed, there was a strange and profound quiet. The phone did not ring. There were no emails, no unexpected visits. It was as if a storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, rain-washed silence. The absence of Amelia and Mark from my life was not a void, but a space. a space I could now fill with things of my own choosing. About a week after the meeting, I received a package in the mail. It was a small padded envelope with no return address. Inside was the silver locket Amelia had taken from Eleanor's jewelry box. There was no note, just the locket, cold and silent. I picked it up. It was a final, petty gesture, a return of stolen goods that was meant to be an insult. But as I held it in my palm, I felt nothing but a distant pity for her. She had given back a small piece of silver, but she had lost something infinitely more valuable. She had lost her family, her history, her soul. She was adrift, and she had cut her own anchor line. I placed the locket back in its rightful place in Eleanor's jewelry box. I did not hear from my daughter again. George informed me that his firm received a brief, angry letter from a lawyer Amelia had hired, but after they responded with a summary of the evidence we had compiled, the doctor's report, the journal, the witness statements from the signing of the will, the matter was dropped. They knew they didn't have a case. The wall I had built was too strong. Life began to take on a new rhythm. I started volunteering at the Veterans Housing Initiative, putting my old engineering skills to use. I wasn't designing bridges anymore, but I was helping to draft plans for sturdy, respectable homes for men and women who deserved a place to call their own. I found a deep satisfaction in the work, in the camaraderie with the other volunteers, in the grateful smiles of the people we were helping. I was building again, not with steel and concrete, but with purpose and compassion. I also began spending time at the hospice. I didn't do much. I read to patients, I sat with families, I tended to the small garden outside the patient rooms. I told them about Eleanor, and in sharing her memory, I felt her presence more keenly than I had in years. The hospice was a place of sadness, yes, but it was also a place of profound love and grace. It was a place that understood the true value of a life. Months passed, turning into a year, then 2. My life was quiet, but it was full. I had friends, I had purpose, I had peace. The house was no longer a silent, empty space haunted by ghosts of the past. It was my sanctuary, a place filled with the warm, living memories of the love Eleanor and I had shared. I often sat in my study in the evenings, writing in my journal, not about betrayal and anger, but about the simple joys of my day, a conversation with a fellow volunteer, the taste of a homegrown tomato, the beauty of a sunset. I look back on that retirement party now, not as the worst night of my life, but as the night I was given a second chance. My daughter, in her careless cruelty, had handed me a gift far more valuable than any inheritance. She handed me my freedom. She forced me to wake up from the quiet desperation of my grief and to redefine my life on my own terms. She meant to write my final chapter for me, to confine me to a small, sad ending. But instead, she gave me the opportunity to write a whole new book. My story is not one of tragedy. It's a story about the quiet resilience of the human spirit. It's about the realization that family is not just about blood. It's about respect, love, and a shared set of values. And when those things are gone, you have the right, and indeed the obligation, to protect yourself and to build a new family from the people who truly honor what you stand for. My legacy will not be a daughter who inherited a house. It will be in the sturdy walls of a veteran's new home, in the quiet comfort of a hospice wing named for the woman I loved, and in the preservation of a simple brick house where a family once lived, and a man, in his final years, finally learned to live for himself. The brochures for Sunset Meadows are long gone, recycled into something new, and so am I.